Hi folks, back again, Bathrobe Chronicles number 189, and this is a real serious one, and yeah, I want to talk a little bit about mental illness and what happened in Arizona. If you've watched any of the recent ones I had on alienation in the workplace, well, for the past 18 years, of course, I'm no longer employed. I did the evaluations that would put people in psychiatric hospitals against their will. And so I'm somewhat familiar with the process and what happens and the criteria and all the other stuff. Sadly, what happened in Arizona, of course, also happened in our state not that long ago. Several years ago, we had a student at Virginia Tech who murdered, to use that word, 32 people, students and faculty at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. After that happened, there were all kinds of meetings and with the state mental health folks, and everybody got together and they were going to do what they could ostensibly to make sure that didn't happen again. So the procedure in our state, I would imagine, is similar to everywhere else, and basically what happens in our state, if it's felt as though someone is meeting the criteria, which is basically because of mental illness dangerous to themselves or others, or because of mental illness substantially unable to care for themselves. And that's sort of a gray area. Well, it's all a gray area actually, but the care for self, you could have a person who's extremely depressed and curled up in a ball, and they aren't bathing, not eating, and so on and so forth. You could have somebody in a manic state who is running around like crazy, so to speak, and never sleeping, and of course not making any sense about anything, and unaware, if you will, of their circumstances and situation. So that's the basic criteria, and I would imagine this is somewhat similar, as I said, in all the states. So the first part is identifying who this person is, and the second part, I guess, would be the actual evaluation that's done. And the evaluation, if it's felt as though the person meets the criteria, then the evaluator goes before a magistrate, gets a court order, and the person is taken to a psychiatric hospital. That's the first part of this process. When the person gets to the psychiatric hospital, they are evaluated by a psychiatrist. I would imagine the evaluations, might be 45 minutes or so. I'm not sure. But, somewhere around 45 minutes or an hour. Then there's what's called a civil commitment hearing. And in our local area here, these are private hearings that are held in the psychiatric hospitals. And the people who would be at the hearing would be a representative of whatever agency, detained the person or what have you. There would be a court psychologist who sits in. There would be a judge or special justice. 99% of the time these are lawyers who act as a special justice, and they've been doing this, a lot of them have been doing this for years. Then there's anyone who is able to give actual testimony. This could be a family member who maybe brought the person to the attention of the system, so to speak. And so basically everyone sits around a table, and ultimately it's decided whether or not the person will stay in the psychiatric hospital, and if so, will they stay on a voluntary basis or on an involuntary basis. And that's sort of the process that gets someone in a hospital. Now, after the Virginia Tech shootings, there were some subtle changes, as I best remember. There were some subtle changes in the rules. I'm sure I read them, but you basically want to conduct business anyway, the way you have been. But they did change one thing. Prior to that time, in the code it was someone who is eminently dangerous to themselves or others. They sort of got that eminent thing out of there. In fact, when they had the eminent part in there, no one actually defined what eminent was. He used to use like 48 hours. I'd say to a family member something like, if something is not done, do you feel someone will be dead in 48 hours? You know, something like that. But they got rid of the eminent. The other part of this is what they try to accomplish is sometimes you will see the same people over and over and over and over and over and over. And maybe they are not meeting the criteria at the moment you see them, but you know within a few hours or a day or so, they will deteriorate, to use that word, or decompensate, to use that word, to the point where they would be meeting criteria. And you know, you use your own judgment on those kinds of things. Sometimes, you know this is coming. So why not get this person some help? Get them in a hospital, get them stabilized again. So they loosened up that. Now the other thing they added or emphasized was, and I was never involved in this part of it, so I'm just going by what I've been told, is what's called court-ordered outpatient treatment. In other words, the court orders you to outpatient treatment. Now, ironically, it's my understanding that the only way that would happen is if the person agrees to that. So, you know, it just makes absolutely no sense. If the person agrees to get treatment, hey, let them get treatment and go about their business. But this, you know, really is kind of wacky. Now, it would be good to actually have a court-ordered outpatient treatment where the judge says, Johnny, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this courtroom and you're going to see a psychiatrist, you know, what have you, once a month, once a week, or whatever. You're going to get a case manager to help you keep your appointments and so on and so forth, and you're going to take your medication and on and on and on. However, that isn't the way it works. And I doubt if this was used just a handful of times. As I said, I've been doing this a long time, and the changes came about 2, 3, 4 years ago, I can't remember. And it's almost unheard of for anybody to have court-ordered outpatient treatment because it had no teeth, so to speak. Now, oftentimes the families would say things like, you know, they only kept him 2 or 3 days, or they only kept her 4 or 5 days. She needs to be in there a long time. Well, there's lots of things at play here. One is an extreme shortage of psychiatric beds, and this seems to be, I know it's all throughout our state, and I would imagine a lot of states are in the same situation. Sometimes these poor folks need to be hospitalized, and you literally cannot find a bed. Or I've got to get my tenses right here. I'm no longer doing this. Anyway, you know what I mean. You couldn't find a bed anywhere. So there are problems with the mental health system in our state, and I'm sure there are problems in other states also. I guess what brought this about, this particular chronicle, is I just read an article in Time magazine, 7 symptoms that were readily apparent for this young fellow who, you know, killed all these people. And you're going to have a whole lot of folks out there running their mouths on TV, being quoted in newspapers and magazines, and so on and so forth. And a lot of them will know what they're talking about, and some of them won't know what they're talking about. But I guess the question is how can you avoid something like this happening when there seems to be indicators, you know, that, hey, something's not right here. What can you do? The Virginia Tech situation. This young man had been acting bizarrely for some time, for lack of a better word, and folks were actually afraid of him. And ultimately he was detained. He went through that first process, you know, of being evaluated, detained, and then there was a court hearing. And I'm pretty sure what the outcome of the court hearing was, at the so-called civil commitment hearing, is that he was told to get outpatient treatment. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, I'm sure, there's no teeth in that. There's no way you can force someone to do that. You can't do it. It's just like you can't force people to take medication, except under fairly unusual circumstances. The only way you can force medication that I know of is if a person has been detained to a psychiatric hospital, is saying, I'm not going to take medication. Then there's another hearing, and this involves the medical doctor who is treating the person, and they have to convince the judge, the special justice, or whomever, that the person will never be stable enough to leave the hospital unless the person does have medication. And then at that time, an order would be issued to force medication. So I guess what I'm working up to is there any way, when you have these signs, these symptoms, if you will, that are popping up, that society can step in and somehow make it so these horrible things don't happen, like just happened in Arizona. And all the so-called psychotic symptoms, if you will, seem to be there for this young man. And in fact, the college where he was going, according to the news reports, of course, told him he couldn't come back unless he got a letter saying that he wasn't a danger to himself or others, And so you say, where does a person's rights end and the rights, so-called, of society begin? On this sort of continuum of mental illness, where does society step in and say, hey, I'm sorry, we're going to do something now. So what you have is a system that is basically flawed, because in most places that I know of, the system is sort of overwhelmed. You have a lack of psychiatric beds. And at least in our state, I would imagine it's the same in many states, if not most states, is there's no mechanism on the follow-up, so to speak. In other words, if someone comes into like a community mental health place to get treatment, they can get what's called a case manager, who will try and make sure they get all their benefits and everything, who will drive them to psychiatric appointments and things like that. However, that case manager has no judicial authority to force this person to do anything. If the person says, screw you, I'm not going to come to my appointments and I'm not going to take my medication, there's nothing that can be done. Then what you have to do is wait till this person decompensates, which is a word that's often used, to a point where that person is meeting the criteria and they're forced back in the hospital. And sadly, there are many mentally ill people, and that's what they do. They cycle. Every 2 or 3 months, they're, forced into a hospital. So I don't know. Let me come back again. Hold on. Be right back.